Mr. Mundy, thank you so much for being here with us today. As you know, there is a lot of news about the vehicle for hire industry out there, and it's a very hot topic, a rapidly changing industry, and we appreciate you taking the time to answer some questions around that for us today.
More than happy to do so.
Well, first and foremost, let's just start with how would you characterize the vehicle for hire industry today?
Right now, I would say that the industry is sort of in the after stages of an initial shock. The industry has, over the years, faced new entrants, people trying to come into the industry, and it's always been under a regulatory framework. Right now, they're faced with unlimited entry into the industry under what would no other way to express it is just complete deregulation of the industry.
Right.
So in state after state, city after city, they have to go through this very expensive process of assessing just what is going to be the future of entry into both the limousine and the taxi industry.
So, Mr. Mundy, what are your thoughts on the legislative activity around the country, both that from the state and local level, in response to the arrival of TNCs on the market?
Personally, I'm rather amazed that state legislatures and city councils would basically be so naive as to say, well, this is a technology company or this is a sharing company. It's a taxi operation, it's a taxi brokerage company when you talk about UberX and Lyft. Uber Black is a transportation brokerage company for really what we call the baby limousine market, if you will, the sort of better car market. But it's all prearranged, it's all perfectly legal, you have to have operating authority. The UberX entry, though, where the operating entity is using their personal automobile, using their personal insurance, very little vetting of their own backgrounds, sort of a dating service vetting that the companies like Uber argue that it's better than fingerprinting, and no one really believes that. It's in the industry, and it's pretty well shown that no, it's not nearly as good. So I think I'm just amazed that venture capital lobbying money can buy that kind of a wink-wink attitude about regulation today. So it literally is an amazing thing to see. It is our democracy at work, but it's a democracy that's being heavily lobbied at this point to ask people to believe the unbelievable.
So, as you know, several states and cities are, as a result of this legislation, establishing watchdog agencies to oversee the regulation of the TNCs. At a minimum, what type of data does a watchdog agency of this type need to collect to effectively protect public safety in regulating TNCs?
One of the really sad things about the 10 or 13 states that have either approved TNCs or are in the process of final approvals in this round of legislation is the fact that they're depending on a state agency, in most cases, to be the watchdog agencies. These watchdog agencies, the state agencies, are not equipped at all to manage all the data needs of thousands and thousands of these new drivers entering into the marketplace. At a minimum, those state agencies are going to need the same data that you literally have for a city in regulation of its taxi services. In the name of public safety, they need to know who the drivers are, that they are qualified to drive, that there are sufficient background checks to understand that no convicted felons or child molesters or other individuals which should not be driving literally are not driving. And there should be, in many states that require this for taxi cab drivers, there should be drug testing. Not looking at, well, we have a zero tolerance policy towards drugs, that's after the fact.
Right.
You want to try to get people out of that driver's seat before they start driving our wives, our children, and other individuals that could be harmed and are being harmed today by drivers that couldn't pass a drug test for many other jobs. So the data needs literally are going to explode for these watchdog agencies, and they would explode for a local taxi regulatory group, because you're no longer talking a few hundred taxi cab vehicles and drivers. You're talking literally 10 to 20,000 perhaps at the state level, depending on the state.
Right. In your opinion, what would an ideal vehicle for hire regulatory framework look like today, given this existence of TNCs?
It really, in structure, shouldn't look too much different from the existing taxi regulatory structure, because the data needs are pretty much the same. Only the technology and the software needed to manage this much larger database is beyond the capabilities of most regulatory agencies today. They simply can't ramp up to handle thousands and thousands of drivers, making sure their insurance is all intact, making sure that their lien holders of the vehicles know that the vehicle is being used as a commercial vehicle, and making sure that the homeowner's insurance, what I call private automobile insurance, has been informed and is knowledgeable that that individual is driving their insured vehicle in a commercial operation.
Right.
So in some cases, you would say that the data is the same, but on a much larger, grander scale. It simply can't be done by simply putting people to it. It's going to have better, well-equipped database systems in order to manage it. Like Mitchell Humphreys.
So what are your thoughts on the litigation occurring as a result of this new legislation? For example, those involving cab drivers who are suing for unfair competition, or those involving TNC drivers suing for employment benefits?
Needless to say, there are numerous lawsuits that are now been filed and trickling through the courts. One, I guess, the saddest thing about our legal systems, one of the saddest things, is that it is so lengthy. These cases take anywhere from 2 to 4 years to so-called ripen, to finally get to where they have been heard and all sides have been able to gather the appropriate information. But I think from the early results, we can honestly say that, especially in California, that the TNC drivers now will be probably declared employees, and the business model for TNCs may have to change dramatically. That's not the only types of lawsuits that TNCs are facing. They're also facing lawsuits with respect to cities that have opened their systems up and allowed these TNCs to operate, and having a very negative effect on the taxi medallions that the city had been promoting maybe 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. These medallion holders had a reasonable assumption that they had something of value. It was traded upon. It was allowed to be traded by the cities in some cases, and literally then it becomes a public taking through the city's action of that particular medallion. So the cities will be facing some lawsuits of pretty high value in most cases. I'm not speaking to the merits of medallions, whether they're good or bad, but I can see numerous lawsuits in the next 2 to 5 years emanating as a result of funds lost through actions of cities and or state legislatures with respect to open entry into the industry. Other lawsuits with respect to accidents and injuries, and whether or not drivers were sort of led to believe they were covered with insurance and then ended up in an accident. Uber is being sued now in Canada for just the same type of operation, that there was an accident, personal automobile insurance did not cover the driver nor the passenger, and Uber has sort of said, well, we'll see. And to the attorneys, we'll see doesn't cut it. They've been sued for it's a multi-million-dollar suit against them. So in addition to employee lawsuits, insurance lawsuits, and there may be some fraudulent advertising lawsuits about what you could make being an Uber driver as being false and misleading advertising. Some of those suits will be coming about also.
That's
Not a good time.
lawyers.
Well, there are so many suits, and it's such a quagmire right now. That's why many of us in the industry believe that it's very difficult for Uber to apply for an initial public offering or an IPO until they clean up and present a legitimate current balance sheet and also clear up some of these lawsuits. It's rather questionable whether or not the SEC would allow them to even comply and be approved for listing on either the NASDAQ or the big board, if you will.
Great point. Where do airports fit into all of this?
Well, airports are a different breed, if you will, from the standpoint of regulatory procedures. They have different concerns than, say, a city. Our advice as an airport ground association to them 2 years ago was stand high on the hill, watch all this fray that's going on, and stand back from it. We have at first fined and confiscated cars because in many cases TNCs were operating illegally on our properties at the airports. And airports, while they have a public use roadway, those are private roadways. And airports build them, they're part of the infrastructure, and they have to have them paid for. But they also are far more likely to be sued if something happens to someone while they're on airport property, as opposed if somebody happens to somebody on a city street. You still sue the city, but it's sort of hard to prove negligence.
Right.
So airports, on the other hand, though, if they allow a commercial operation in which the drivers are not properly vetted or necessarily have standards for one group of operators operating the same way as a group of other operators are operating the same way, they very well could be held liable. That's why airports have traditionally always asked to be co-insured, which meant that the insurance had to be upfront, had to be current, and they would be notified if in an event no one paid their insurance policy.
Right.
So they were covering themselves.
Right.
So it's going to be a little different. Not all airports are accepting TNCs and this basic business model that says, trust me, we have insurance. No, they want to be co-insured. Some airports are insisting that drivers have real background checks, not the dating service background check that I mentioned earlier, but fingerprinted criminal background checks so that, especially with respect to terrorism and allowing non-bad people to get to the airport curb. So I think you'll see battles continuing at airports that say, the state says that you may operate, you're a perfectly legal entity, but it also says we can set the standards as an airport because we have to, one, recover our fees, and two, ensure the public safety, but also protect our infrastructure interest, i.e. against lawsuits. On the other hand, airports are in the business to serve people. They're in the business to provide alternatives for transportation and ground transportation. And they're also in the business of paying for their facility. TNCs have been known to offer higher fares per passenger being picked up. Venture capital money is fantastic. It's great to be able to use for those sorts of things. So they, in essence, have to buy their way into a number of airports. Airports are still pretty much on the fence with respect as to whether or not they're going to buy the Uber model of allowing them to do the background checks and literally drug testing. Some airports are simply not going to buy it. Airports are also questioning whether or not they can use a different system to collect their monies. Uber would like them to use geofencing, in which they are charged through the app automatically as they come onto the airport premises. Some airports are saying, well, what happens if you turn off the app?
Right.
We don't get our money, and we've got a dangerous situation because somebody is operating without legitimate insurance coverage on our airport. So these are issues that airports are going to have to grapple with and are doing so now.